So what's MERN? What does MERN stand for? The M stands for MongoDB, and that is a database solution. The E stands for Express. I'll come back to what this is in a second. The R stands for React.js, and this is a browser-side JavaScript library that helps us build amazing user interfaces. And the N stands for Node.js. This is a server-side JavaScript runtime, an environment where JavaScript code can be executed outside of the browser. And now Express.js is a framework for Node.js, so it in the end makes building Node.js applications easier. Now combined, these technologies form the so-called MERN Stack. They work together particularly well, and you can build amazing full-stack web applications with these four technologies working together. So let's take a closer look at each of these technologies to understand which role it plays exactly in that tech stack. So what's React? React is a client-side, so on the browser, library which allows you to build highly reactive user interfaces. So it's all about building user interfaces. With React, you write JavaScript code that will be executed in the browser. And since it runs there, it is responsible for controlling what the user sees on the screen and how things there change when a button is clicked, when something is entered into an input box. It's really all about that. It's about rendering a user interface with dynamic data and about updating it when data changes or when certain events occur. It's about handling user input and providing feedback to the user. And it's also, and that is where the other three technologies will come into play, it's also about communicating with backend services. And with backend, I mean services or technologies that don't run in the browser of your user. So React, so to say, is the front end. The other three technologies, Node, Express, and MongoDB, together make up the backend. Now we use libraries like React, and there are alternatives like Angular, with which you would have the MERN Stack instead of the MERN Stack, which do the same, but we use such technologies to provide users with a mobile app-like user experience, where everything happens instantly, where we have a great reactivity, where things on the user interface really feel great and instant, and we simply provide a really awesome and amazing user experience. Now what about the other technologies? What is Node exactly? It's a JavaScript runtime typically used or often used to create server-side JavaScript applications. Now, technically, that's not the only thing you can use it for, but it is one of the most prominent use cases and scenarios. You can use Node.js to execute JavaScript outside of the browser. And since it runs outside of the browser, you can, for example, use it to create a web server with it. So to run it on some machine which is exposed to the internet, which then accepts requests and sends back responses. So we can then use JavaScript as a server-side programming language, as an alternative to PHP, ASP.NET, Java, and so on, basically. With Node.js, we can listen to requests and send back responses. We can execute server-side logic, and we can also interact with databases and with files, things we typically don't do in the browser or we can't do in the browser. Since we're not tied to the browser anymore, there are certain things we can't do anymore. For example, interact with the DOM, because there is no DOM, it's running outside of the browser. But there are new things we can do. For example, well, write files or do things like this. And therefore, as I said, it's an alternative to other server-side programming languages. And just like those languages, it's also important to note that it's rarely used standalone. Instead, typically, we use it combined with Express. And Express is a Node.js framework, so we still write Node.js JavaScript code, but we get utility functions and a certain way of structuring and building our applications, so a certain rule set we adhere to basically, which makes building Node.js applications much, much easier. So it's based on Node.js, but gives us new functionalities. It's strictly middleware based, and you will learn what that means throughout the course, which means we have a clear way of handling requests, a clear funnel through which all requests are passed, where we then can extract data or prepare the response. And in general, With other features like routing, view rendering, and more, we got a lot of tools and clear rules that almost force us to write amazing and really well-working Node.js applications. So it really simplifies the usage of Node.js, and if you know PHP, it's a bit like what Laravel is for PHP, an amazing framework that simplifies the usage of the language. And that leaves us with MongoDB. What is MongoDB about? MongoDB is a NoSQL database engine which allows us to store documents in so-called collections instead of records in tables as we would have it in SQL. So it's a database engine. It's all about storing data. It's about storing our application data specifically. We use MongoDB in this course and in general to store, for example, our users, our products, or whatever our application is about. Unlike SQL, it doesn't enforce a schema for our data. We can still build one and use one if we want to, but we're not forced to. And we also don't need to work with relations. We can still set up kind of relations, but it's all a lot looser than it is in SQL. You're not forced to do these things. And this is the case on purpose, of course, because it also gives you many advantages. For example, NoSQL databases like MongoDB often give you amazing performance because they're way more flexible. It's also very easy to connect it to Node and Express, because as you will see throughout this course, writing queries against MongoDB is really straightforward and super easy when working with JavaScript anyways. So it's really fun and easy to use MongoDB in JavaScript applications. Now, for security reasons, as you will also learn throughout this course, we don't connect to MongoDB directly from inside our React application. Instead, we do that with the help of Node and Express, and that is how we then have all these technologies work together. So it's a powerful database which can easily be integrated into a Node Express environment. Technically, however, you could also swap MongoDB for other database engines. It wouldn't be the MERN Stack anymore because, well, our M would be gone. But of course, you could also build an app with React, Node, Express, and some other database. But as I said, MongoDB really works well and is super easy to use. So we learned about the individual technologies. What's the big picture then? How do these things work together? Now we can differentiate between the front end and the back end if we want to, or client and server. What happens on the client is our front end. What happens on the server side is our back end. And on the client, we use JavaScript, or specifically React.js, to build an amazing user interface. On the server side, we use Node, Express, and MongoDB. Now we use JavaScript here for the presentation and the user interface. We will build a single page application with it, and I will come back to that later in the course. And on the server side, we have all our server-side business logic. We can store data persistently, either in files or in a database. We also implement our authentication logic there, for example. And technically on the server, we even can split Node Express from MongoDB, because as you will learn throughout the course, MongoDB will actually also run on its own server, its own machine, but it all happens outside of the browser, so I all consider this to be the backend. Now that of course leaves us with the question how client and server communicate, and that will happen with help of requests and responses, HTTP requests and responses, which are exchanged between these two ends. We will send background HTTP requests from inside our React JavaScript app to our server side, to our Node Express application, and this application will then reply with responses. And we will also exchange data, typically in the JSON format. This is how this will generally work together. This is how this will be connected. But we will have an entire theory module where we will take a closer look at this. And then, of course, we have a huge course project which we built from scratch, where we will build all these different areas, where we will build the front end and the back end and connect to a database and so on. And there you will, of course, also see all these things come together.
So this is the big picture, but what's inside this course now? We are almost done getting started, and in the next module, we'll dive into the MERN in theory. So we'll have a look at all the 4 core components of the MERN stack, MongoDB, Express, React, and Node.js. We'll see how these work and how they are connected to, well, finally build the MERN stack. With that theoretical part out of the way, it's time to dive into our course project then. We will start with the React frontend. For this, we'll use features like components, hooks, routing, and we'll also add front-end user input validation. And with that, towards the end of this module, we will have a nice looking and, from a front-end perspective, working application. What's missing here, of course, is the backend then. Here we'll focus onto Node and Express, we'll create our own REST API, implement our own routes, use controllers and models, and as we did it for the front end, now it's time for the backend user input validation. Besides that, we'll also learn how we can connect our backend to a real database, MongoDB in our case here. With that, the backend will be finished. What's missing here, of course, now is the connection of these 2 ends, and that's what's going to happen in the next module. With that, we will have our first draft of the working MERN application here. Few things are missing though at this stage. One thing is file upload. Covered in the next module, here we will learn how we can store files, images in our case, on our own server. Following the file upload, we'll work on authentication. The authentication module will mainly cover the user sign-up and the user login logic, so that only if you are logged in, for example, you can access certain parts of our application. And with that, our application will be built. We will have a full MERN stack application at this stage. There is only one last thing missing, and this is the last module, which concludes the course, the deployment module, because up to this point, we were working in a local development environment. Here we will learn how we can deploy our app to a real server in the internet. So as you can see, lots of topics to cover in this course, lots of things to learn and to explore. And before we dive into the course now, let's have a look at how you can get the most out of this course. Our goal is that you get the best possible learning experience whilst following along this course. So how can you get the most out of it? Well, first, watch the videos. Sounds easy, it's an on-demand video course in the end, but it's important to watch the videos and to also watch the videos at your speed. You can adjust the playback speed in the Udemy video player, so make sure to use this feature to watch the course videos conveniently. Watching the videos is nice, but also code along. This is a very crucial part of the learning process. The whole course is interactive, so take the chance, code along, and important, pause and rewind. Don't just code along and don't understand what type of code you're writing and why you're writing it. In case something is unclear, pause and rewind, watch the lecture again until you really understand what you're doing here and why you're doing it. Besides coding along, practice is of course something that we highly recommend. Following along the course is great and you learn all the core things you need to create your own MERN stack applications in this course. But you should advance on your own, create your own projects or enhance the course project according to your needs. These are all things that will help you in the long term. Practice, play around, and with that, become a MERN stack master. Now, on the way to become a master, debugging and searching is also something that will happen to you. Things can go wrong when writing code. This is also a crucial part of the learning process in the end. But it's important to have the right approach for debugging the code and for searching for solutions. For that, you can find the use code attached to the last lecture of each module in the course. So in case you're stuck, make sure to download this code and compare it to your code. You might have a tiny little mistake, and with that approach, you can quickly find it and continue with the course. Also Google in case you have any kind of error message. Chances are that if you have this problem, another person had this problem too, and with that, a solution can be found quickly via Google. Besides Google, you can also use the integrated Udemy search function. That's also very helpful. With that, you can search through the course content, and you can also search through the Q&A section, because that's the last important step to make sure you get the most out of this course. Ask and answer questions. In case you're stuck and you can't continue, ask in the Q&A section of the course and we'll do our best to help you as quick as possible. But in addition to asking, it's also important to answer questions, because answering is so much more rewarding. Asking is easy, right? But answering and helping others, this is really great, because nothing can go wrong here. If you give a wrong answer, somebody will correct you and you will learn, or if you gave the right answer, you practiced your knowledge and the person who asked the question gets an answer. And that's basically a win-win situation for everyone. Now with that, you are well prepared for the course, and this means we can now dive into the course and continue with the MERN stack in theory now.